Hello, I am Malika Shekhar, a haematologist in London, UK. Welcome to my podcast series called The Bitter Pill that looks at lessons that we doctors may learn from history. This podcast is called Testing Times. It lasts about 30 minutes. Testing Times. In 1984, tests for HIV were being developed. The pace was hectic. Who would develop a good test first, and whose would be best? How can we get our samples, our patients, tested ASAP? In this podcast, we explore a third aspect. What do we do with the results? Once tests were available, there was a flurry of activity to use them in people with haemophilia. Doctors sent off their patients' samples to be tested. Many hospitals had banked samples, so they were stored samples frozen after routine clinical tests. These samples were batched and sent off, and at that time point, the patients weren't consented. We will look at this question as it unfolded in Scotland. In Scotland at that time, there was confidence that their factor concentrates were safe from HIV transmission. This was because they were largely self-sufficient in producing concentrates and they didn't rely on imported products from USA. Also, Scottish haemophilia centres were closely networked with their blood service and their government. This likely influenced their ethos and their responses. These responses are instructive. In autumn 84, unexpected results arrive. About 15% of their patients test positive. This podcast explores their response. What happens when you get unexpected results and want to action it? What are the clinical and ethical implications of this? The material for this podcast is extracted from the YouTube recordings of the current UK infected blood inquiry. We'll hear extracts of evidence provided under oath from two doctors, Professor Chris Ludlam from Edinburgh and Professor Gordon Lowe from Glasgow. The inquiry's examination of practice in Scotland began on the 1st of December 2020, World AIDS Day. The chair of the inquiry, Sir Brian Langstaff, started the day by noting that 33 million people had died of AIDS across the world. The podcast is in 4 parts. We start with Prof. Ludlam in Edinburgh. It's titled Results. We then move to Glasgow to hear Prof. Lowe. There are 2 extracts. Where does a doctor's duty lie? And how prompt is prompt? We then return to Edinburgh to hear the final extract, the Yorkshire Post journalist. Results. Professor Ludlam started as a consultant at Edinburgh Royal Infirmary in 1980, before AIDS was reported. His centre had 250 patients, of whom 50 had severe haemophilia. He is in receipt of abnormal results, and he is grappling with how to understand it, communicate it, and how to action it. He seeks advice. He attends a large meeting in London where many doctors face similar problems. Here is Prof. Ludlam questioned by Jenny Richards, counsel to the inquiry.
We can see that by the 29th of November then, Professor Ludlam, a number of organisations or individuals, including ministers, have been told of the situation. Patients at this stage are still in the dark, aren't they?
Yes.
Why was it a very difficult ethical problem to decide whether to tell a patient that they have antibodies to HTLV3?
At this time, I think there was a lot of activity, a lot of discussion, and I was waiting for the meeting on the 10th of December to happen to get the view of my colleagues and for a full discussion about the issues. We could have informed patients sooner. We could have indicated patients that results were available sooner. But we were considering actually how the best way was to manage the situation. And to think what we should be saying to patients, and what patients would want to know. This took us, I have to say, very much by surprise, and a lot of activity going on, and we needed to, as it were, get our minds in order and our systems, decide what our systems should be. So that's where we were. I didn't want information being spread by rumour, because that didn't help.
Eventually, on the 19th of December of 1984, a group meeting took place at the Edinburgh Royal Infirmary. By that time, you had known the results for 16 patients, as well as a larger number of negative results, for nearly 2 months and had not told a single patient.
That's correct, yes.
Even though patients were known to be infectious, and this was a disease known to be sexually transmissible. Why the delay, Professor Ludlam?
I think the implications of it all were so enormous, actually, that it took us a bit of time for it all to sink in and for us to think of the best way of responding. And as you see, there were a series of meetings, and I was keen to gather as much wisdom and help and advice as I could, so that I could help the patients as I thought was best.
Did that delay not place at risk not only those who were in sexual relationships with the infected patients, but bearing in mind that we're talking about a cohort of severe haemophiliacs, family members or other contacts who might come into contact with their blood?
Well, as far as family members are concerned, they were all very aware of that any blood spillages potentially contained infectious viruses. That was well established, and patients treated themselves, and they knew about avoiding blood contact with other family members. So far as connection with possibility of sexual transmission, yes, there was a 2-month delay. The risk was very small, but it was a small risk, and looked at in retrospect, if I had sent out some information on the very early in November, we would have had a lot of patients who were suddenly on our doorstep wanting further information and distressed, and it might have been too much for us to cope with. The stress, it's easy looking back with literally 20/20 vision, but it was a very difficult time, and certainly I do see that in retrospect maybe we should have done things differently, and we certainly learnt a huge amount from the way we responded to the whole of this episode in relation to AIDS. For example, when it came to considering issues related to new variant CJD, we took a different approach, and we had learned from a very stressful event surrounding HTLV3, and particularly as things rolled out the end of 1984 and into 1985.
In this excerpt, Professor Ludlam talks about his surprise on receiving these abnormal results. He makes 3 points. He wants to bring his mind in order, construct a meaning to the results, a vocabulary to use with his patients, understand how Scottish blood got infected. How would his patients wish to be told? He wanted to have systems in place before telling his patients, so his problems were partly ethical, but also technical. Second, he doesn't think that the delay in communication posed much risk. People already knew to be careful because of hepatitis B and non-A, non-B. Third, this whole period provided much learning when it came to subsequent years. It's generally accepted that communicating results of tests is a responsibility of the requesting clinician. How promptly this is done depends mainly on the significance of the result to the patient's care. Professor Ludlam's quandary lay with the understanding of the significance of these results. Are his reasons for delay familiar to us in current-day practice? Is a delay of a few months justified? We have a perspective on these questions from Professor Gordon Lowe, a younger colleague, in this next section. Where does the doctor's duty lie? Professor Lowe started as a consultant at Glasgow Royal Infirmary, later in 1985. In 1984, he worked under the supervision of Dr. Forbes in Glasgow. In this extract, he talks about Dr. Forbes's practice. He draws a distinction between research and clinical tests. Research tests provide a denominator value rather than an accurate result for a particular patient. He explains the rationale of why it was inappropriate to communicate this to patients, but is entirely appropriate to action it at public health level, inform the blood supply chain, and publish it so people are aware. Professor Lowe is questioned by Sir Brian.
Two questions arise out of the chronology when it was known in September/October that 15.6% of the Scottish cohort were seropositive on one test, and the fact that they weren't, any of them, told about that until after mid-January at the earliest, 1985. The first is when you were asked about Dr. Forbes, and you said you thought that he might have been very conflicted as between his duty in publishing his research and his duty to the patients concerned. Where do you suppose the ethical position lies? Might it not perhaps lie with the duty to the patient as trumping all?
No, Sir Brian, I don't, with respect. I think the first duty of all the haemophilia centre directors in Britain who sent samples, stored or unstored, usually without permission from the patient, was doing a time-tested emergency procedure in public health. You have the first test for a spreading pandemic of a virus, and the public health approach is to say, oh, there's a test for this baffling new, potentially fatal disease, which at least gives us some measure of the exposure to this virus in the blood donor population, which has gone to the high-risk group of patients who'd had multiple exposure. I think that was the ethos of doing the study. The prime purpose there, it was, we need to know, what is the risk? We need to test it, and it's important to publish the prevalence and take appropriate measures. And the most important thing that arose from the testing in Scotland was, as soon as the data is clear that it is the SNBTS products and not just the commercial products, these are the current products, and this transmission must be stopped. And hence, what's the action that we need to take? How soon can you get heat-treated, virally inactivated concentrate to replace, as soon as possible, the stuff that patients on treatment have in their homes? This is an emergency. This is a public health emergency. You have to stop further infections. And I think that this was addressed extremely rapidly in SNBTS, and it could be done. And that was just a very appropriate thing to do. I think the first obligation of testing a sample of stored serum samples in patients with haemophilia or any other group that's an at-risk population to establish the extent of a new infection and take appropriate action to turn off the tap, to stop any further patients being infected is a priority. But the second obligation clearly is what do you do now? And this is the dilemma that not only Dr. Forbes, but other haemophilia centre directors are confronted with.
Well, you're telling me is that you think that the doctor's obligation here is primarily, first, to public health, where there is a pandemic or an epidemic or some serious transmissible disease involved, rather than to the patient. And I was going to ask you, when it's a real question, is whether you know of anything that might have prevented Professor Forbes telling patients, even between the date that the manuscript was prepared for publication and the date it was published. After all,
yes, I can.
After all, they might have been regarded, might they not, as potential transmitters of a disease, if indeed they did turn out to be infected, and thereby, by telling them, you might perhaps serve the interests of public health as well. It's not a matter of fact.
Could I address that now,
Certainly.
Sir Brian? So, number one, public health, because you can do that very quickly. And you don't need anybody's consent to do that. Turn off the tap, stop the flow. The second obligation of a doctor, who's also a researcher, is to say, now, what do I do about telling the patient? And what I was going to say is that Dr. Tedder is there, and he's talking about the tests. And he said, well, could I just say that my test is not very good? It's not been clinically validated. It's suitable for research, and I have reservations about its accuracy, and I am not alone. I think, briefly, he's saying the test that I have, and indeed the test that Dr. Gallo has, is a research test. The virologist's view is this is a test for research. It gives you an idea. It gives you a direction. It is probably fine for public health control because you've got quite a large number of patients. You have reasonably reliable data to take a course of action, advise the government, Department of Health, whatever. But your next obligation is you have a test that is not being clinically validated. There are false positives, there are false negatives. And you have to think, if you tell the patient about a research test that is not clinically approved, what would be the consequence of giving a patient a false negative test and the patient says, that's absolutely fine, I'll go on having sex or not modifying anything that could result in transmission to another person. And then, months or years later, it turns out to be positive. That's a catastrophe. On the other hand, if you have a false positive test and the patient's life is ruined and they jump off a bridge or whatever, and then it turns out when a reliable test comes along, it's actually truly negative. And that is the difficulty. And it makes very clear that the ELISA tests, the first ones out, are not reliable and must always be confirmed by a reliable assay, which he eventually had. Now, that is the right way to do it, because then you're giving patients a correct diagnosis and correct advice. And that is why Dr. Forbes was very professional in this, and he sent early appointments to the patients that were positive on the Gallo test, which was unreliable, explained the position, and say, I want to tell you about this test, but it's important that we want to repeat all the tests in all our patients with a reliable test so we know what the true situation is. And that's important for you and your family, and that's important for us. And that is the ethical action that he took. I think it would be the same in all the other haemophilia centres that use the Tedder test. I would have hoped that they would have thought in the same way.
But the thing which has been puzzling me a bit is this. If a test is done, a sample is sent off for a test, you might expect a result back. You might know what result you'd like to see, but the whole point of the test is finding out what the result is, isn't it? I mean, that must be logical, otherwise why would you test if you already know the answer?
Well, you're testing to see what in UK patients with haemophilia, what changes you might see.
Until 84, the tests coming back showing there are positive HIV infections, seropositivity in a number of patients. The question is really, the samples are sent off from stored sera to Gallo's laboratory. They come back, there is shock and horror because they're positive. The question is, why didn't not you personally, but why wasn't it anticipated that might happen? Because that's the whole point of testing. All the more so because there might have been a red flag flying or a warning amber light, however one describes it, the question for you with that introduction is, did Dr. Forbes give you any indication that he had, in advance of the results coming back, thought about what he might do if they were positive?
All I know was he said, it's bad news. We've got these results and I'm trying to struggle what to do with them. And I mean, I was there when Dr. Forbes said, you do know that this is not a test that you can provide reliable clinical information. And I think I saw a moment when he thought, oh my God, I've got the information, but Dr. Follett tells me that there's no way, as a local clinical virologist, he could defend a clinician giving an unreliable result. But meantime, we have to change the non-heat treated concentrate ASAP to prevent any further things, and that was the important thing. The difficulty then was to encourage Dr. Follett to get a reliable test as soon as possible, as everybody does. It wasn't just Glasgow. So when people say, as the newspapers do, patients should have been told immediately, well, that's difficult. There are consequences to that. So I think that in diagnostics, the clinician has to be very aware of the limitations of a test. I can hear what you're saying, Sir Brian, but I think the correct ethical decision that Dr. Forbes made was not to instantly ring up the patient and say, a research test is positive, but it might not be positive. I don't think that would have been appropriate medical practice.
This excerpt started with a discussion of where the doctor's priorities should lie in an epidemic. Prof. Lowe considers the public health priority as the primary concern in this particular crisis. His points are, the purpose of doing research tests in HIV is to assess the denominator. The focus is on samples rather than patients. The obligation of using such test results is to inform public health. And in fact, using research test results for clinical purposes is inappropriate. In current practice, our duty to an individual patient may be overridden, for example, by other patients' needs or emergency public health imperatives. But on the whole, fortunately, this schism is less sharp. We attend to our individual patients' needs by acting within the constraints posed by situations. Testing samples in the context described by Prof. Lowe was and is a common practice in epidemic situations or when new tests become available. Batch testing without consent, undertaken to answer a wider question. Does that still occur? Is that familiar to us? These critical issues with HIV resulted in major policy changes in how we deal with samples. Pre-test counselling, informed consent, and the distinctions between research tests and clinical tests, all of these came out of the HIV pandemic. But questions remain in our practices. We faced these dilemmas of prioritization and testing during the COVID-19 pandemic. They also go beyond the pandemic. How should we use new tests? How do we deal with large-scale, unexpected results? What about informed consent for tests when it's neither standard clinical practice nor research? Say, for example, hepatitis E testing when it was first introduced. Lack of consent, not being informed when a test is being undertaken on a stored sample, and not telling patients the results promptly, these are major concerns for patients. And finally, tests are fallible. Test results are constructed. These constructions are based on assumptions and premises. How prompt is prompt? In this extract, Professor Lowe discusses the finite time it takes to set up a system to deal with the fallout of communicating results.
Can I ask you this, also in the light of the chronology? You say there that you think that Dr. Forbes' letter was very prompt. How do you support that in the light of the chronology?
It was prompt because by this time he had arranged a system in which he could tell the patients in an appropriate manner. And that system was first to get an experienced counsellor to join him in speaking to the patient and their families if they wished about what the situation was. I think that was prompt action.
Very prompt?
How prompt is prompt? I don't know.
The words are yours.
Dr. Forbes has the results by October? So let's work out the chronology. So what's he going to do? How soon can I get a reliable test? But I think pretty immediately, her own evidence, I think, says, I turned from seeing kidney patients 4 days a week to seeing haemophilia patients 2 days a week. It was very promptly arranged. So both stages of the process were appropriate, but meantime, having done that, I think it was appropriate to publish the information in the Lancet. I think that's an important contribution to the epidemiology. I think that is not too bad a sequence of events.
Thank you very much.
This excerpt deals with the promptness of communication with the patient. Here, Prof. Lowe observes that it takes a finite time period to implement a system to take testing to the clinical level. A research test has to be clinically validated. This particular point directly affected how his consultant, Dr. Forbes, communicated results to his patients. And finally, he describes how Dr. Forbes was as worried as Prof. Ludlam as to how to manage the results, starting to implement steps before communicating the results to his patients. Dr. Forbes and his colleagues spent time establishing a structure to deal with the aftermath, starting from the reverse end of communication rather than from the front end. Let's now move back to Edinburgh for the final extract, the Yorkshire Post journalist. Here, Professor Ludlam talks about how he eventually communicated results to his patients, and he reflects on his uncertainties.
Why did you organise a group meeting in a lecture theatre at the Royal Infirmary rather than invite 16 patients to come and see you confidentially and privately, one by one? Why did you think a group meeting was a good idea?
Well, I went to the meeting on the 10th of December in London at Elstree. It was a big meeting. We've discussed it. It was important, and I was keen to get other people's views. I turned up at work the following morning to receive a phone call from the Yorkshire Post. A reporter said he had heard about the Edinburgh episode, and he wished to publicise this in the Yorkshire Post the following day. And I was absolutely furious with him, that because this sort of publicity is not the way that patients should be informed about the situation, whether they're antibody positive or negative. And so he agreed to come up and see me. I think he came up perhaps the following day, and I begged him to delay. He was desperate to publish his story in case someone else, some other newspaper, had published it first. And I was very upset and very cross. And I eventually persuaded him to wait about a week before publishing it. He told me, okay, he would publish it on I think it was the 20th of December, which left me a handful of days to decide what to do. And there was no way that my staff could see everyone. So the next best thing was to write to all the patients and say that we were holding a meeting about AIDS and HTLV3 on the evening of I think it was the 19th. If they liked to come, we would tell them more. And if they weren't able to come, but wished to discuss the situation, to get in touch with me. That's how the meeting came to be held. It wasn't my idea of the way of informing patients about what had happened, but I was, as it were, doorstepped by the Yorkshire Post and what I think was not good behaviour.
If the threat of impending publication had not been made and precipitated the meeting in the way you describe, is it likely then that 1984 would have come to an end with your patients none the wiser?
I think I would have written to the patients saying results have become available. If they would like to know the results, please make an appointment to come and see me. And I would have, as you know, we sent out an information sheet. I would have sent that out or something similar to it and to all patients, and then, as it were, monitored as we did anyway, who would have come to see me. That's what I would have done had the Yorkshire Post not intervened, and actually worked reasonably well for the majority of patients. They were appreciative, actually, of a bit of time to think about whether they wished to know their result or not. It was very interesting seeing patients in early 1985, and patients really appreciated the opportunity just to reflect, to talk about themselves, because the implications of knowing that you were antibody positive led to another series of questions, and with the outside world not being very sympathetic, to put it mildly, to people with haemophilia once it became common knowledge that a number were anti-HTLV3 positive, patients wanted, and their families wanted, a bit of time before they came to see me.
Can I just, before we break, just pick up on a couple of points which arise out of this last exchange. You've told us how really stressful a time it was, having sent off your blood samples to Richard Tedder, and having got back about the 26th of October at least 6 positive results, and then a few days later a total of 16. And you've essentially, I think, given a description of not quite knowing where to turn, just trying to work out, come to terms with the situation. Am I right in that?
No, you are correct. Was very much taken aback.
So obviously you thought it was very, very serious indeed. Am I right?
Yes, that's correct.
At this time, you drew a distinction between HIV, or HTLV3 as it was then, and AIDS. And you had a belief that the chances of developing AIDS were somewhere between 1 in 100 and 1 in 500. But that still struck you as being very, very serious.
The seriousness was related to the fact that people appeared to have become infected. That was serious enough, if you like, and consequences of that were, to some extent, unknown. And that is also unsettling.
Was it because they were not only, to some extent, unknown, but well appreciated, both by you and plainly by the popular press, if they were chasing the story, that it might be very serious indeed, possibly deadly?
I think it was the uncertainty that was stressful. I entirely agree that if I had known what we subsequently learnt, that if you're antibody positive, the chance of getting AIDS was very high indeed, yes, that would have been stressful, difficult, but at least that would have been, if you like, a known fact. What was so difficult this instance was trying to cope with the uncertainty. Was this actually a situation where 100% of those infected were going to get AIDS, or was it a case of only 1%? And trying to cope with that and explain to patients and ourselves that degree of uncertainty for a serious disorder was taxing. Does that help?
It is helpful to an extent. Yes, thank you very much.
The medical imperative of publishing results is mirrored in this extract by the lay press's interest in beating their colleagues to the press. In Edinburgh, this precipitated a group meeting. Prof. Ludlam describes the circumstances in harrowing detail. While the clinicians are certain about their uncertainties, the lay journalists are interested to highlight the extremes. In his experience at that time, patients appreciated having space and time. This, though, hasn't been borne out with time. Patients across UK have questioned the legitimacy of such delays. 30 years on, there are complaints about that aspect. He ends with his reflections on uncertainty. How will HIV behave? What does it mean to have a HIV positive result? Does it mean you're protected? None of this was clear. He was unsure as to how to position the seriousness of the situation. In December 1984, the significance of HIV positivity was not clear. Was it like Hep B, where antibodies were protective? The Hep B model was also used by many doctors to visualize how HIV may behave, the 1% or the 100% question. Most clinicians at that time, in this situation, positioned their communications in the optimistic, reassuring end of the spectrum of outcomes. In summary, this podcast considers predicaments around blood tests in the past and how this has influenced the way we deal with it at present. We have heard two doctors talk about a systemic response to communication in the midst of confusion and the lessons they learned from that period. Based on lessons from this period, our duties and responsibilities in testing our patients are clearer, but many grey areas remain, calling for our professional judgment. It also raises the question, where does the doctor's primary duty lie? Could this question be rephrased for contemporary practice? Could this be rephrased as, how can a doctor contribute to the public and the global while attending to the individual? Thank you for listening to this podcast.